After being a dominant force throughout the 1980s, side-scrolling shoot-'em-ups were in a weird place in 1994. The genre had largely been pushed out of the arcades by one-on-one fighting games, and console gamers were drunk with the possibility of 3D shooters like Star Fox. That's one of the reasons why Android Assault, the Revenge of Bari-Arm, was clobbered by critics at the time. GamePro called it outdated and uninspired, but I didn't care. I was won over the moment the animated intro popped up on the screen. And after a quarter century of being completely overshadowed by 16-bit shooters like Gaiares and ThunderForce 3, I think it's about time we rediscover this forgotten classic. So turn back now if you want to know what happens next, because today we're going to spoil the story and ending of Android Assault, the Revenge of Bari-Arm. This is Game Over, the early years. With a name like The Revenge of Bari-Arm, I always just assumed that Android Assault was a sequel to a game that we never got in the United States. In reality, it was a brand new IP for Human Interactive, and also their first and only foray with the Sega CD. It was simply called Bari-Arm in Japan, but when publisher Big Fun Games brought it over to the West, they decided to add a bunch of words and create a needlessly complicated title that hinted at a bigger, grander scope. But what does it all mean? Well, I'm just gonna let this great intro movie explain the story of Bari-Arm.
AD 2192. The independent military nation Zeus has been established in the colony Olympus on Saturn's rings. Zeus equipped its symbolic machine Guzan Jiao and other armies with a living fighting computer geosystem. They then started to attack the Earth's United Nations on the planet Jupiter. Initially, the Earth's United Nations put all its power to fight in defense, but was defeated by the powerful geosystem. To stop the invasion, the Earth's United Nations equipped its variable fighter Bari-Arm with its own geosystem and fought back.
So yes, you take control of the Bari-Arm, a ship partially created from researching the Zea's invasion. The idea is to save humanity by pushing back at the android invasion, which I'll confess is not the world's most original setup for a shoot-'em-up. In fact, there's a lot here that's pretty standard fare for the genre. But does it even matter when your spaceship can transform into a giant robot? As far as I'm concerned, the game could be set in the world of Teletubbies with the music of William Hung, and I'd still be there on day one just as long as it transforms into a robot. What, those pop culture references are still relevant, right? No? Alright. Anyway, like the cinema says, this is a game about shooting down androids. We start our journey on Ganymede, which is one of Jupiter's moons. It has a lush forest filled with trees and rivers, which eventually leads us through this cave, underwater, and then against this massive mech that dwarfs the puny Bari-Arm. But size doesn't matter, and we move on to Gravity Pagoda, which is a factory stage where we not only fly horizontally, but also vertically. We eventually get back to flying from left to right, but things speed up when the next boss shows up. He's kind of a pushover, which makes the whole fight a little anticlimactic. But before we can complain about that, the Bari-Arm is tossed into the front lines. It's here where we're swarmed with not only warships, but also a whole army of robot fighters. This seems overwhelming at first, but our hero has a plan. He's gonna find a way into one of those warships and destroy it from the inside. This involves fighting another large flying boss, who seems a little surprised to see you there. Now, after blowing up the warship, we move on to Olympus, a gravity-defying world with cities both above and below the Bari-Arm. It's easily the coolest looking level, but it's also the deadliest. We eventually meet up with this two-armed boss who tosses out a combination of fire and lasers. We destroy it and reveal the boss was merely a shell, so it's time to fight a much smaller and faster mech. This leads to the moon base, which is mostly about dodging bombs as you speed through the facility. There's a big boss at the end, but isn't there always? With all that out of the way, we descend to the planet through the blue skies and white clouds. We're almost to the end now, so the plan is to fly through the rocky depths underneath the water. This sets us up with a battle against this robot fish boss that feels like it was lifted directly out of the Darius series. But before anybody has a chance to sue, we fly to the Bayside City. It's a futuristic setting right out of Akira, and also our final stop on this journey. We buzz through the tunnel in hopes of shaking the enemy ships, but all it does is let the city change into its nighttime look. Our final fight is against this ugly, floating alien creature. It really is hideous. But watch out, because after you shoot it a bunch of times, it spawns some arms and goes in for the kill. But what it underestimated was our little Bari-Arm and humanity's will to live. We fight back and blow up the boss, and this is what happens next. This is a great 16-bit ending, especially for a shoot-'em-up. My only complaint with this ending is that it doesn't have any voiceover. When you start the game with a guy narrating the story, you sort of expect more of that at the end. Of course, the truth is, I'm not even sure I would have thought about that if not for them showing both a man and a woman in the Bari-Arm. I mean, up until that point, I had just assumed that it was a one-man operation. But I guess that's only because they didn't establish any of the characters. All it would have taken was the woman saying something like, "We did it!" and the guy responding with a "Hell yeah!" and the whole ending would have been elevated. Well, that and adding music. This ending definitely needed some music. Critiques aside, I really like this ending, and the game. It's not as original as Sylphid, and the story pales in comparison to Gaiares, but the soundtrack kicks ass and the ship turns into a robot. What more do you need? Hey, thanks for watching this episode of Game Over, The Early Years. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new episodes every Monday. Now, here's the question I have for you. What game franchise would be improved by adding transforming robots? It's a simple question, so I'm excited to see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back tomorrow with Electronic Gaming Monthly's best reviewed games of 2000, followed by reviews of Rift Keeper, Vampire the Masquerade, and more. If that sounds good to you, then I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.